Fantastic. Hope you got to enjoy some of the exceptional posters and get a bite to eat, I suppose, depending on your time zone and bandwidth. But I think we should jump right into our next slate of fabulous invited speakers. So I am excited to introduce you to Rob Chavez, who is going to be talking to us today about shared brain-to-brain representations of the self and group members in interpersonal perception. So glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. Let me share my screen. All right, can people see that? Oh, good, no hiccups. Yeah, so today I'm going to share with you some work that my lab and I have been doing over the last few years, looking at how our brains represent information about ourselves, other people, and how they're shared across different people using a variety of different fMRI techniques mostly, but hopefully combining it with some interesting paradigms that maybe you haven't seen before. All right, so if you will for a second, just imagine, rather than this virtual pre-conference, we were doing this in real life, right? Back in the olden times. If you were to attend this talk, let's say, you might walk into a room, look around and see something like a chair, right? You need somewhere to sit, you focus in on the chair, it's there in the room, right? So we presume that the chair is actually out there in reality, and of course, that's a good assumption. But what we really experience this as is as a mental representation that's encoded within patterns of brain activity under the hood, right? So, yes, the chair is out there, but the way that we experience is actually through these patterns of brain processes that are happening. So the cognitive neuroscientists over the last 20 years or so have developed actually some really sophisticated ways of trying to decode these kinds of brain activity patterns to see what kind of stuff you might be thinking about or interested in looking at, experiencing, right? So you don't have to know all the details of this model, but essentially what they've just found is that at least when it comes to certain kinds of perceptual processes and other kinds of processes, you can get really good predictive power about what people are looking at, bottles or shoes, looking at patterns of brain activity under certain contexts, right? So the way that they've done it is by developing these methods. They're often referred to as multi-voxel or multivariate pattern analysis, right? And these are a little bit different than the standard fMRI methods that you might be used to in the following ways. So let's say we were to take this little chunk of cortex right here. So this is the primary auditory cortex. It likes when you hear sounds, right? And it's comprised of all these little voxels, these little three-dimensional pixels that we use to measure brain activity in space, right? So if we were to play you some audio clips, let's say somebody saying ra and somebody saying la, and measure brain activity in the primary auditory cortex, you're gonna get activity for both of these kinds of sounds there, right? And the average univariate activity might not be able to differentiate between ra and la, right? The auditory cortex likes these sounds, it'll both come on for both these things. So if you were to contrast these two things, you wouldn't actually see a difference, right? However, the underlying pattern of activity, even if there's no mean difference in activity, might really dissociate these two different kinds of percepts. And that's what these NVPA methods are capturing, right? So rather than caring about rahs and lahs or chairs and bottles and shoes, right? We might care about things that are more interesting to social psychologists, right? Things like other people, right? People in our environment, how we're navigating different situations, or even ourselves, right? This is back when, there's an older picture clearly, right? My older former self. So how can we use some of these methods together to answer questions that social psychologists might be interested in, right? Well, one of the ways that we can do this is by trying to better understand how these things are represented in the brain. And what we know about self-referential processing and other kinds of social cognition like mentalizing is that they share a somewhat dissociable but largely overlapping system of brain regions serving these things, right? And maybe by using some of these more sensitive multivariate methods, we can kind of disentangle these to some degree, right? So that's what we're getting at. There's a lot of overlap in these processes, and maybe we can try and get at it a little bit. So the way that we've typically done these studies in social neuroscience has kind of been something like this. We'll have somebody come in, we'll have groups of people come into to our studies. They'll be asked questions about the self, right? Make a response, and they'll be asked questions about another person, let's say a famous person like former President Obama, right? This is a powerful design because you get to contrast self-referential activity with another person. The problem is that that other person is usually the same person for everybody in the study, but is somebody you don't actually know, right? I don't know President Obama very well, but we all know who he is, right? So that's why we use that. On the other hand, other studies have been like, well, let's not do it like that. Let's have everybody pick a friend to think of, right? So it's a close other. The problem with that design is that everybody in the study has a completely different person, right, that they're contrasted against, right? And we were thinking, how can we combine the best of both worlds here to get out of this? And we did that by using these round robin designs. So round robin designs, I'll walk through a little bit about how it works, but hopefully it can get the best of both worlds in that everybody is thinking of the same people and we all know those people to some degree. And there's multiple people too, so that's another bonus. Right, so what are we talking about with round robin designs? So the way that we did things is that we recruited people to come into the scanner, let's say Jim here, and we had him come in and answer questions about himself. So we're getting his brain responses to himself, right? We also had a bunch of people in his immediate group come in to answer questions as well. So Jim answered questions about himself. He answered questions about everybody else in his social network, his little group. They answered questions about him. They answered questions about themselves and every combination thereof, right? So this is what this round robin design is kind of getting at, that everybody in the scanner in the study is both a participant and a target for everybody else in the study, right? And that allows for some really rich data analytic opportunities and allows you to ask questions that you might not otherwise, right? So this is kind of part of the motivation for this was based on this old work from the 80s, looking at consensus and personality judgments, right? This meaning when Jim fills out a personality scale, let's say a Big Five measure for himself, when other people rate Jim, especially when other people are aggregated across one another, you can get a pretty accurate representation, personality rating of Jim, especially in these aggregate measures, right? Where everybody might know Jim in a slightly different way. So aggregating across everybody allows for a closer, a wisdom of the crowds kind of thing, a closer accuracy of Jim, right? So we want to know if we could do these same things, but basically instead of personality scales, apply it to fMRI patterns, right? Patterns of brain activity. So that's basically what we did, right? So it's just like we described before. We had people come in and answer questions about themselves while in the scanner. We had them answer questions about other people within their social networks. And then we applied these multivariate pattern analysis techniques in order to kind of disentangle these things, right? So this is the basic paradigm that I'm going to be talking about for the whole talk, but this is what we did. So how does this work? So what we did was we basically had people come in, we had them do a different kind of self-referential activity task to isolate parts of the brains that are involved in thinking about the self. And then we use that region to do the rest of these pattern analyses. So it was defined independently from the other data, right? What we found consistent with a lot of literature is this area of the medial prefrontal cortex is consistently involved in self-referential processing. So our question is now, okay, let's take out the voxel activity from that information, the multivariate patterns from that, for Jim when he's thinking about himself, and let's in the same region get all the voxel patterns for people in his network when they're thinking about Jim, right? What we can do, just like they did with the personality surveys, is we can aggregate across these representations and then directly compare them to the brain activity patterns when Jim is thinking about himself, right? And when we do that, we can just simply look to see how similar they are, right? So what did we find? So when Jim is thinking about Jim, and when you compare that to the aggregated representation of Jim across people in his network, there's indeed a strong correlation there, right? So that seems to be evidence for these things, right? Well, what about Pan? Even better, right? So when you look at other people, they're stronger, right? But this is kind of a weak test of this hypothesis. Maybe it's just somebody thinking about anybody, right, that would do this. So we actually looked at this to try and compare it. So when there's a congruent response, when the group is aggregated for Jim and is compared to Jim, how's that compared to the group aggregate to Jim and Pan, right? So not so much. Oscar and Phyllis even less, right? So this became the basis for this analysis that we did, was basically trying to fit a multi-level model to see where correlation distance for congruent self trials was lower, meaning more accurate, less distance, for the congruent self trials when people are thinking of Jim and Jim's thinking of Jim, as opposed to the incongruent trials. Jim thinking of Jim, but people thinking of somebody else, right? And indeed, there seems to be a significant relationship between patterns of brain activity that are specific to the individual targets as opposed to any other target in general, right? One thing that you might ask is, okay, does this relate to behavioral findings from these same people, right? So if we have them do this personality scale, is this related to the variability, so to speak, in the brain aggregated representations? And indeed, that's what we found as well, right? So in both the last set of analyses and in this one too, we use both frequentist and Bayesian methods, pick your flavor, but we found a significant relationship there, right? So what's going on here? Well, what we're, kind of like when we're talking about things in other parts of cognitive neuroscience, when people are perceiving chairs, we can pick up on chair information in their brains, right? But hopefully, in a similar way, we can capture things that are specific to other kinds of individuals in our environment, right? In that patterns of brain activity aren't just reflecting some abstract thing, but there's actually a real model of somebody else out there in the world, right? So we called this, I don't love this term, but this is what we came up with, the self-recapitulation effect. Namely that your self-referential brain activity is sort of recapitulated in the brains of others when they're thinking about you. So another way to think about it is there's a model of you that exists in the brains of others when they're thinking about you that is somewhat similar to yours, right? And just like any other model, it's incomplete, it's not perfect, but we can pick up on it a little bit with these even crude measures like fMRI, right? But one of the things that kind of bothered us about this was that, there's still some variability in terms of how well we're able to recapitulate certain individuals, right? So, what's going on with some of these people up here who maybe don't show this effect quite as strongly, right? And the problem with this first study that we did is that it's a really small sample, right? So we use these Bayesian methods, it's mostly within subject comparisons, but it was still just a round robin group of 11 people where everybody was the target and the perceiver. Now, the problem with trying to extend round robin designs to bigger studies is that it becomes intractable at a certain level, right? You can't have 40 people thinking of 40 other people, expect a good brain signal from that, along with a few other issues. But one solution to that is rather than having one large group of round robin things, do a bunch of different groups of smaller little round robin designs. And then you can get your sample size up, get a diversity of groups, and be able to do some of these individual differences things, right? And that's exactly what we've done for this last set of studies, right? So in our latest round robin study, what we did is we recruited 20 independent groups of people, 6 people per group. These were student groups, coworkers, friends, sports teams, a bunch of different kinds of people to participate in the same kind of paradigm as we were talking about before, right? And this indeed allows us to ask and answer more questions than we could before. We get information about groups, we get information about variability among people that we can model in our designs, right? So because we have this larger sample, we can detect things that maybe we didn't before, test these ideas. So here's the original localizer from the task I just showed you in our original sample of 11 people, right? When we do a similar task in this larger sample, we again see the medial prefrontal cortex, which is pretty common, but we also see larger parts of the brain, social brain networks that are involved in these things. And again, these are other brain regions that have been implicated in social cognition more broadly, but we can look at those for our current analysis, right? So then the question is, do we replicate this recapitulation effect in the larger sample? Hooray, right? So indeed, when we use a multi-level model to look at, kind of nesting groups and kind of target subject effects, did we still see that the correlation distance is lower for the congruent trials, self-thinking about the same target, to the incongruent trials, right? So that's good. But if you remember, part of what was motivating the study a little bit was to try and understand what's going on with these people kind of out on the fringe a little bit, right? Why are some of these people not getting recapitulated as well as others? So in order to kind of get at this in a way that kind of more tied in with what we had done before, we thresholded these initial red regions down to only the most significant parts from our localizer analysis, which will leave the MPFC, which is the most consistently shown brain region in these processes. We wanted to see, okay, what's modifying the self-recapitulation effect within these areas, right? So we're going to focus in on these blue regions for this analysis. So one thing that we might be interested in is whether or not self-esteem modulates this, right? So medial prefrontal cortex is involved not only in self-representation, but other parts of reward processing, positive affect learning, these type of things, and maybe self-esteem, which might affect these things as well, right? These kind of self-evaluative processes. So what we did was we calculated the recapitulation effect as before in these areas of the MPFC, and we correlated it with a global measure of self-esteem, right? So this was my hypothesis. I thought, hey, brain activity patterns in this are going to be more accurately reflected by groups. So the higher your self-esteem, the more accurately you're going to be recapitulated, because that sounds like it makes sense, right? My graduate student, Mariah, who's also getting training in clinical psychology and sees clients more often than I do, had a completely the opposite idea. She was saying, no, people with higher self-esteem may develop these self-protective biases against some of the social threats or pressures or everything that might actually lead them to dampen their self-recapitulation effect in some sort of way. Guess who was right? So self-esteem does modulate the self-recapitulation effect in the medial prefrontal cortex, but it's the opposite of what you might think. So people who have lower self-esteem were more accurately recapitulated in the brains of their friends, right? So put differently, people with higher self-esteem are not as well reflected in the brains of their friends. And this seemed to be specific for the medial prefrontal cortex and not true in other parts of the brain that aren't involved in evaluative processes, right? So this is interesting because it shows that, it's not that this whole network is online at the same time and doing the same thing, but rather the evaluative processes underlying these things are modified in a specific way and in a way that may support some theories more than other theories, right? Within the same sample, we can also ask questions that are not necessarily related to self, but more general kind of related to social life, right? And how we make friends. Right. So in these social groups, some people are really close with one another. They get along, they're friends, right? But, there's also some people in our social groups that we're around a lot, but maybe we don't like as much as other people in that network. So in this version of this study, we had people do the round robin thing again. We had them think about themselves and all their partners just as before. And what we're doing is across all these different parts of the brain, looking to see where two different people thinking about an individual target might predict their social relationship strength, right? So, so the question here is dyadic social relationship strength related to similarity in brain responses when two people are thinking of another person in their group, right? So we have perceiver 1 and perceiver 2, where we're measuring their brain activity when they're both thinking about a different person, a target, right? We can also ask, capitalizing on these groups that we have, is when people think about the groups in general, are they kind of accurately, or is that related to their social relationship strength, right? So, there's different, you can think about individuals or you can think about the group as a whole, but we can kind of capture that. So what we were looking at was brain response similarity for these different things across friendship, measures of friendship, knowing, liking, and similarity. What we found that consistently across these different metrics, the DMPFC, which is a region involved in mentalizing and other kinds of social cognition, was consistently, the more similar your two brains are, the closer people were across these relationship metrics. The same was true in the anterior insula when we were doing it one at a time. For the group level responses, it was just within the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex that it did this, right? So we found, the more similar people were when thinking about their groups as a whole, the more accurate, the closer they were in these regions, right? So, we may be asking what's going on here, target congruence for individuals. There's a bunch of different theories that get at this, things like social hierarchy learning and general cognitive processes. I don't have time to go into too much of this stuff, but it's an interesting finding that dovetails with other things we know about literature, but puts it into a context where we have two brains sharing representations about individuals that drive our closeness, right? So just to give a summary quickly, self-referential brain activity is reflected in the brains of peers when they're thinking about you, right? That's what we found evidence for in some of our studies. These studies are distributed across broad social brain regions, but are modulated by self-evaluative processes in the MPFC, right? So not everywhere. And we also found that social relationship strength between dyads predicts similarity and fine-grained patterns of brain activity when people are thinking about members of their group or their group as a whole. So just to kind of break this down one more way, right? What does this mean for social psychological theory? And this is hard, but I think we're thinking about, right? So social cognition and self-representation are multifaceted psychological processes, and they're supported by functionally dissociable, but kind of structurally entangled brain systems, right? So, one way to think about this is with this analogy, two very different people can participate in many of the same activities and share many of the same environments. The same thing is kind of going on with individual brain structures when engaging in certain kinds of social cognition, right? Just because this brain region is active for self doesn't mean it's also not, active for thinking about other people as well. Interpersonal perception processes, like the ones we're getting at here, are encoded in these distributed fine-grained patterns of activity and not strictly localizable to one region or another, right? And they're not all modulated by the same factors like we saw with the self-esteem thing. So another way to think about this is, with analogy, we all play part in shared goals, let's say, but just because we're all working together on a given task doesn't mean we all have the same job, right? And that's kind of how I think about these neural systems in general. So to better understand how information using fMRI can inform social psychological theory, I think it's important that researchers, not only in cognitive neuroscience, but also in social psychology more generally, need to adopt a view of the brain that kind of moves away from these simple one-to-one isolationism thinkings. What does this part do? What does that part do? And move away from just this, what is happening in this one brain at a time, instead try to compare across two different brains, thinking about the same things in different situations. And, I don't have an analogy here, but I'll just underscore the fact that, complexity begets complexity. Social cognition is complex, and we should expect the same kind of things to play out when we're pressing it against measures of the brain, which are also very complex, right? And with that, I will end by thanking my lab at University of Oregon, especially my graduate students, Taylor Guthrie and Mariah Stendel. And thank you all for listening.
Great. So in the interest of time, I think maybe we'll have time for one question. Does anyone have any questions for Rob? It was a great talk. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was going to go. So, I love this like Ceremo kind of social neuroscience approach. I think it's really fun using sort of social relations models. And in some of that early work with Kenny, a lot of the consensus stuff didn't actually relate to accuracy, meaning how I judged myself. But in a lot of that work, right, it was a specific trait. And so I'm just wondering what you think about the difference sort of from that early work with what you're seeing in terms of the neural representations.
It's actually hard to run social relation, like the Kenny style social relationship models in these brain imaging data using MBPA type approaches, because when you're just using like a how high is your self-esteem, well, you have a value and you can look to see the consensus of that value, but we're looking at similarity patterns at each one of these things. So there actually isn't a framework to do a straight social relations model type thing here. And what I'd love to do is to try and develop a framework to do that, but I haven't done that yet, and that'd be an exciting way to go. But what does it say about that? It's not totally clear. It's not totally clear to me, and that's indeed what's driving some of these questions that we're doing. Is just how much social these kind of standard interpersonal perception processes are at play in different ways. And again, we haven't developed the methods to answer them in the way that Kenny did, as straightforwardly as with these regular behavioral methods.
Great. Well, there's also some questions in the chat. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on. Thank you so much, Ron.